I should have known the moment his Armani suit touched my cheap coffee that my life was over, that the universe had finally decided to stop playing games with me and just end it all in one spectacular, catastrophic moment that would probably make headlines in whatever newspaper bothered to report on the mysterious disappearance of nobodies like me. Most girls worry about getting fired for clumsiness, about losing minimum wage jobs that barely keep the lights on. But standing there in that upscale Manhattan cafe with lukewarm espresso dripping down the front of what was clearly a $10,000 suit, I wasn't worried about getting fired. I was worried about getting buried alive in some unmarked grave where my mother would never find my body and would spend the rest of her cancer-riddled life wondering what happened to her only daughter. The man standing before me, coffee soaking into expensive Italian fabric that probably cost more than 3 months of my combined rent, wasn't just any businessman running late to some corporate meeting where the worst consequence would be a stern talking to from a boss who golfs on weekends and complains about his wife. The serpent tattoo creeping up his neck, emerging from his collar like some ancient warning written in ink and violence. The dead silence that fell over the cafe so completely that I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears like war drums. The way grown men, actual full-grown men who looked like they broke bones for a living, literally stepped back and melted into the walls as if they could disappear into the expensive wallpaper. All of it told me that Dmitry Volkov didn't need an introduction, didn't need business cards or resumes or LinkedIn profiles to announce exactly who and what he was. New York's most dangerous man just got baptized in my double-shot espresso with 2 pumps of vanilla and oat milk. And the way his steel-gray eyes locked onto mine with the intensity of a predator who'd just spotted prey that dared to wound it, told me that mercy wasn't on the menu, wasn't even in the same building as whatever was about to happen to me in the next 60 seconds of my rapidly shortening life. My hands were shaking so badly that the empty coffee cup I was still holding clattered against the ceramic saucer I'd managed to somehow keep balanced during the collision, creating a sound that seemed to echo through the frozen cafe like gunshots in a cathedral. And I watched those gray eyes track the movement with the kind of focus that made my stomach drop into my shoes. Everyone always says that when you're about to die, your life flashes before your eyes. But standing there under the weight of Dmitry Volkov's gaze, all I could think about was how monumentally unfair it was that I was going to die over coffee, over a stupid accident that happened because I was running on 4 hours of sleep after pulling a double shift at the hospital where I cleaned rooms and changed bedpans, followed by 3 hours stocking shelves at a 24-hour convenience store where drunk college kids threw up in aisle 5 and expected me to clean it with a smile. This was supposed to be my good job, my easy job, the one where I got to wear a clean apron and make overpriced drinks for people who tipped in crumpled singles and sometimes, on really good days, 5s. The job that was supposed to help me scrape together enough money to make a dent in the impossible mountain of debt my father had buried our family under, with his pathological need to gamble away every cent that passed through his worthless hands. "I am so incredibly sorry," I heard myself saying, and my voice sounded strange and distant, like it was coming from someone else entirely. Someone who still believed that apologies mattered to men who had serpent tattoos crawling up their throats and eyes that looked like they'd seen every circle of hell and decided to make a summer home in the deepest one. I was already reaching for the towel tucked into my apron, already moving forward with some insane instinct to try to clean the mess I'd made, to somehow fix the unfixable and maybe, just maybe, walk away from this with all my teeth and fingers still attached to my body. "Please let me help you. I can clean this. I can pay for the dry cleaning. I can—" My words died in my throat the moment his hand shot out and wrapped around my wrist, and the contact sent electricity racing up my arm that had nothing to do with attraction, and everything to do with the sudden, primal understanding that I was being held by something infinitely more dangerous than I'd even imagined. His grip wasn't painful, wasn't the crushing vice I'd expected from a man who reportedly broke spines like breadsticks, but it was absolutely immovable, as final and certain as a prison door slamming shut. And when he pulled me closer with one smooth motion that made it clear he could move me anywhere he wanted, regardless of my opinion on the matter, I found myself near enough to smell his cologne, Something dark and expensive that probably had a French name I couldn't pronounce, and cost more than my monthly rent. "Your name," he said, and his voice was exactly what I'd imagined the devil would sound like if the devil spoke with a Russian accent that turned every word into something between a caress and a threat. Smooth and deep and utterly devoid of the rage I'd been expecting, which somehow made it so much worse because rage I could understand. Rage was human, but this calm curiosity was something else entirely. "Adelina," I whispered, because apparently my survival instincts had decided that honesty was the best policy when dealing with men who could make people disappear with a phone call. And I watched something flicker across his face that might have been interest, or might have been the look a scientist gets when examining a particularly fascinating specimen under a microscope. "Adelina Russo, and I really am sorry. I wasn't looking where I was going. I've been working since 4 in the morning, and I'm clumsy on a good day, and I will absolutely pay for any damage. I can set up a payment plan or—" "Russo," he interrupted, and the way he said my last name made it sound like he was tasting it, rolling it around in his mouth like expensive wine. And I saw his eyes narrow slightly as if he was accessing some mental database that contained information I definitely didn't want him to have. His thumb had started moving against the inside of my wrist, a small circular motion that I don't think he was even aware of, and I could feel my pulse jumping against his fingers like a trapped bird. "Vincent Russo's daughter." The bottom dropped out of my world, and I felt my knees actually buckle slightly before I locked them and forced myself to stay upright through sheer stubborn will. Because of course he knew. Of course a man like Dmitry Volkov would know exactly who my waste of oxygen father was, would know about the debts and the gambling and the increasingly dangerous people my father had borrowed from in his endless quest to fund his addiction. "Yes," I managed to say, and I hated how small my voice sounded. Hated the defeat that was already creeping into my posture, because I'd spent the last 3 years trying to distance myself from my father's choices, trying to build something resembling a life from the wreckage he'd created. And now here I was, standing in front of New York's most feared man, while wearing my father's mistakes like a scarlet letter. "But whatever he owes you, whatever he's done, I'm trying to pay it back. I'm working 3 jobs and I've been making payments to everyone I can find, and I know it's not enough. I know it's never going to be enough, but I'm trying." Something that might have been amusement flickered across Dmitry's face, transforming his features for just a moment into something almost human, almost approachable, before it disappeared behind the mask of cold calculation that seemed to be his default expression. "You think I'm here about money," he said, and it wasn't a question, but a statement that somehow made me feel incredibly naive, like a child who'd just realized that the monsters under the bed were real, and they'd been there all along, just waiting for the right moment to strike. "I don't know why you're here," I admitted, because lying to a man who could probably smell dishonesty, the way sharks smell blood in water, seemed like a spectacularly bad idea, and I was already in enough trouble without adding stupidity to my growing list of offenses. "I just know that running into you was the worst thing that's happened to me in a year full of terrible things, and I'm genuinely sorry about your suit, about the coffee, about existing in your general vicinity and making your morning worse than it probably already was." He laughed then, and the sound was so unexpected that several people in the cafe actually jumped, including Marco the manager, who was watching from behind the counter with the kind of pale, sweaty terror usually reserved for people who'd just realized they'd wandered into a minefield. Dmitry's laugh was rich and dark and completely at odds with everything I'd heard about him, with the stories that circulated through the city about the Russian Bratva leader who'd consolidated power by systematically eliminating anyone who stood in his way, who ran everything from the docks to the Diamond District, with an iron fist wrapped in designer leather gloves. "The worst thing," he repeated, still holding my wrist, still standing close enough that I could see the faint scar that cut through his left eyebrow, and the way his pupils had dilated slightly while he looked at me with an intensity that made me feel like I was being stripped down to my bones and examined for structural weaknesses. "You have no idea what worse looks like, Adelina Russo, but you're about to learn." He released my wrist then, so suddenly that I actually stumbled backward a step, and I watched as he calmly pulled out his phone and made a call in rapid Russian that I couldn't understand, but that made everyone within earshot look like they wanted to crawl under the nearest table and pray for mercy. When he finished, he looked at me one more time with those impossible gray eyes that seemed to see straight through every defense I'd ever built, and then he turned and walked out of the cafe with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing that the entire world will move out of your way or suffer the consequences. I stood there, frozen and shaking, until Marco practically materialized at my elbow with his face doing a complicated dance between relief that we were all still alive and terror about what might happen next. "Adelina," he said in a voice that was trying very hard to be calm and professional, and failing miserably. "You should probably go home for the day. Take some time to process what just happened. Maybe consider moving to a different state or possibly a different country." But before I could respond, before I could even begin to process the surreal nightmare my morning had become, a man in an expensive suit who'd been sitting in the corner booth throughout the entire encounter stood up and walked over to me with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested this wasn't a social call. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had clearly been broken and reset several times. And when he stopped in front of me, he held out a small black card with silver lettering that caught the light like a knife blade. "Mr. Volkov requests your presence this evening at 8 o'clock, he said in English that carried only the faintest trace of an accent, and his eyes were flat and professional in a way that made it clear this wasn't actually a request, no matter how it was phrased. "The address is on the card, and a car will be sent for you at 7:30 from whatever location you provide." "And if I don't come?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Already felt the trap closing around me with the inevitability of a bear trap snapping shut on an animal stupid enough to step in the wrong place. The man smiled, and it was the kind of smile that never reached his eyes, the kind that made promises about pain and consequences that would echo through generations. "Then Mr. Volkov will be very disappointed," he said simply. "And you don't want to disappoint Mr. Volkov, Miss Russo, because your father's debt was purchased this morning by our organization, which means that as of 9:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, you and your family belong to us now." He placed the card in my trembling hand, turned on his heel with military precision, and walked out of the cafe, leaving me standing there with the weight of my new reality crushing down on my shoulders like a physical thing. I looked down at the card, at the address in silver lettering that I recognized as being in one of the most exclusive areas of the city, the kind of neighborhood where people like me only went to clean houses or deliver food to back entrances. That evening, as I stood outside the massive iron gates of what could only be described as a Gothic mansion that looked like it had been transplanted directly from some European nightmare, watching as they slowly swung open to reveal a long driveway lined with trees that seemed to whisper warnings in the autumn wind, I realized that spilling coffee on Dmitry Volkov hadn't just ruined my day. It had irrevocably altered the entire trajectory of my life, and the only way to find out whether I'd survive the change was to walk through those gates and into whatever hell waited for me on the other side. The mansion loomed before me like something pulled from a fever dream, all sharp Gothic angles and dark stone that seemed to absorb the fading evening light rather than reflect it. And as I walked up the long driveway with legs that felt like they might give out at any moment, I couldn't stop thinking about all the crime documentaries I'd watched where women walked into houses like this and were never seen again. Their stories reduced to grainy photographs on late-night television shows that asked viewers to call with any information about their whereabouts. The front door opened before I could even raise my hand to knock, revealing a woman who had to be in her 70s, with kind eyes that seemed completely out of place in this monument to darkness. And she ushered me inside with gentle hands and words in Russian that sounded almost maternal, which only made the whole situation more surreal, because apparently even the devil employed sweet grandmothers to answer his door and make visitors feel momentarily safe before leading them to slaughter. She guided me through a maze of hallways decorated with art that I was certain belonged in museums rather than private homes, past rooms that glimpsed lives of obscene wealth and careful curation, until we stopped in front of a massive wooden door that looked like it had been stolen from a medieval castle and repurposed to keep out invading armies, or perhaps to keep something terrible trapped inside. The elderly woman knocked twice, received a response in that same dark velvet voice that had haunted my thoughts all day, and then she opened the door and gently pushed me forward with an encouraging pat on my shoulder that felt like a grandmother sending her granddaughter off to her first day of school rather than into a meeting with New York's most dangerous criminal. Dimitri's study was exactly what I should have expected from a man who ruled an empire built on blood and fear. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, filled with leather-bound volumes that looked like they'd been collected over centuries. A massive desk made from dark wood that could have comfortably seated 6 people for dinner. Persian, rugs that probably cost more than my mother's entire medical treatment, and the overwhelming scent of leather and bourbon, and something darker that I couldn't quite identify, but that made every instinct in my body scream at me to run while I still had the chance. He was standing by the window with his back to me, looking out over grounds that stretched into carefully manicured darkness, and he'd changed from his coffee-stained suit into another one that was entirely black, and fit him with the kind of precision that suggested it had been tailored specifically for his body, making him look less like a businessman and more like the personification of every dark thing that lurked in the shadows of this city. "Adelina Russo," he said without turning around, and hearing my name in his voice again sent shivers racing down my spine that I told myself were from fear and nothing else, certainly not from the way his accent wrapped around the syllables like a physical caress. Precisely on time, which shows either admirable punctuality or an understanding that keeping me waiting would have consequences you'd prefer to avoid. "I've never been late to anything in my life," I said, and I was proud that my voice came out steady, despite the fact that my heart was trying to break through my ribcage and make a run for freedom without me. Being late costs money I don't have, wastes time I can't afford to lose, and creates problems I'm not in a position to fix. He turned then, and the full force of his attention in the low lamplight of his study was almost a physical thing. Those gray eyes traveling over me with an assessment that felt both clinical and somehow intimate, taking in my best dress that was still obviously cheap and worn, my shoes that I'd polished until they shined despite the cracks in the leather, my hair that I'd tried to tame into something presentable despite having exactly 15 minutes and a broken brush to work with. "You worked today," he observed, and it wasn't a question because men like him already knew the answers before they asked, already had files and information, and probably a complete dossier on my pathetic life, sitting in a drawer somewhere in that massive desk. "All 3 jobs, despite the incident this morning, despite knowing you had this meeting tonight." "I have bills to pay," I replied, lifting my chin slightly in defiance, even though defiance was probably the last thing I should be showing to a man who could end my existence with a phone call. "My mother's medical expenses don't stop just because I had a bad day, and the electric company doesn't care that I accidentally assaulted a crime lord with overpriced coffee." Something flickered across his face that might have been amusement, or might have been appreciation for the fact that I hadn't completely dissolved into a puddle of terror on his expensive rug, and he moved away from the window with the kind of predatory grace that reminded me of nature documentaries about big cats stalking prey through tall grass. He gestured to one of the leather chairs positioned in front of his desk, and I sat because standing felt like it was using energy I might need later for whatever nightmare was about to unfold. And I watched as he settled into his own chair, with the kind of casual authority that suggested he'd sat in that exact spot while making decisions that altered the fates of countless people who never even knew their lives were being rearranged by a man in a Gothic mansion on the edge of the city. "Your father," Dimitri began, and I felt my entire body tense at the mention of the man who'd systematically destroyed everything our family had ever built, "is an interesting case study in human weakness and the consequences of unchecked addiction." My father is a selfish bastard who cares more about the next card game than he does about his dying wife or his daughter, who's working herself into an early grave trying to clean up his messes, I said. And the bitterness in my voice was impossible to hide, because I'd stopped trying to hide it months ago, when I'd realized that defending him, or making excuses for him, only prolonged the agony of accepting who he really was. If you're looking for me to defend him, or plead for mercy on his behalf, you're going to be disappointed because I stopped caring about what happens to Vincent Russo around the same time he pawned my mother's wedding ring to pay for a poker tournament in Atlantic City. Dmitri leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers in front of his face in a gesture that would have looked contemplative on anyone else, but on him looked like a predator calculating the best angle of attack. And those gray eyes studied me with an intensity that made me feel like every secret I'd ever kept was being extracted from my brain and catalogued for future use. You're aware that his debt has reached $750,000, he stated, and the number hung in the air between us, like a death sentence, because that kind of money might as well have been 7 million or 7 billion, for all the chance I had of ever paying it back in this lifetime or the next 3. You're aware that this debt was spread across multiple organizations, each of which was becoming increasingly creative in their collection methods. I'm aware that my father is a coward who let his addiction put a target on all of our backs, I said, feeling the familiar rage building in my chest that I usually kept locked down because rage didn't pay bills, or cure cancer, or make impossible debts disappear. I'm aware that I've been making payments wherever I can, trying to keep the worst of them from showing up at my mother's hospital bed or burning down what's left of our lives. And now all of that debt belongs to me, Dmitri said, and the simple statement carried the weight of finality, of doors closing and options evaporating like morning mist under a harsh sun. I purchased every outstanding marker, every IOU, every promissory note that carries your father's signature or your family's name, which means that as of this morning, the Russo family debt is consolidated under one roof, and that roof happens to be mine. I felt like I was falling even though I was sitting perfectly still. Felt the world tilting on its axis as the implications of what he was saying crashed over me in waves of cold understanding. Why? I managed to ask, because it was the only word my brain could form, the only question that mattered in the face of this incomprehensible revelation. Why would you do that? Because this morning, a woman with fire in her eyes and coffee on her hands stood in front of me without the slightest idea of who I was or what I could do to her. And instead of cowering or crying or begging, she apologized with genuine remorse and offered to fix what she'd broken, he said. And his voice had taken on a quality I couldn't quite identify, something that lived in the space between curiosity and possession. Because when I touched your wrist and felt your pulse racing like a frightened bird, you didn't pull away or flinch. You stood your ground and met my eyes like you had every right to exist in my space. And that kind of courage in the face of certain danger is either spectacular stupidity or something far more interesting. It was stupidity, I said flatly, because letting him think I was anything other than a desperate woman trying to survive seemed dangerous in ways I couldn't even fully articulate. Spectacular, monumental stupidity born from exhaustion and bad luck, and the kind of day where you've already accepted that nothing could possibly get worse, so you might as well face whatever comes next with your chin up. He smiled then, and it transformed his face in ways that made my breath catch, despite every logical reason I had to be terrified. Made him look almost human for a moment before the predator reasserted itself. Regardless of the motivation, you've captured my attention, Adelina, and I find myself in the unusual position of wanting to make you an offer. I don't have anything you could possibly want, I said, even as my mind raced through terrible possibilities of what a man like him might consider valuable in a woman like me. And I felt my hands clench into fists in my lap as I prepared myself for whatever degrading proposition was about to emerge from his mouth. You have a year of your life, Dmitri said, pulling open a drawer in his desk and extracting a thick document that he placed on the polished wood between us, like a contract with the devil himself. You have the ability to follow instructions, to maintain discretion, to exist in spaces that most people would find uncomfortable or frightening without falling apart. I don't understand, I admitted, because nothing about this conversation was going the way I'd expected, and the uncertainty was somehow worse than if he'd just told me outright what horrible fate he had planned for me. I'm offering you a position, he explained, sliding the document across the desk toward me with one long finger. Personal assistant, live-in, available at all hours for whatever I might require, which includes but is not limited to attending meetings, accompanying me to events, and participating in business negotiations that require a certain aesthetic. You want me to be your assistant? I repeated slowly, trying to find the trap in the words because there had to be a trap. Had to be something I was missing in this offer that sounded too good to be true, and therefore absolutely was. For 1 year, he confirmed, and then he named the terms that made my blood run cold. You'll live here, in this house, in a room I'll provide, with access to anything you need but restrictions on your freedom that I'll outline in the contract. You'll be available to me whenever I call, day or night, for whatever purpose I deem necessary. You'll attend events that will likely disturb you, witness things that you'll wish you could forget, and maintain absolute silence about everything you see and hear. And in exchange? I asked, because there had to be an exchange. Had to be something that made this slavery-adjacent arrangement worth considering. In exchange, at the end of 1 year, if you fulfilled your obligations without attempting to run or betray me or otherwise break our agreement, your father's debt will be completely erased, he said, and the words hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. $750,000, gone, wiped clean, as if it never existed. I stared at him, trying to find the deception in his face, trying to understand what angle he was playing, because men like Dmitry Volkov didn't make offers like this out of the goodness of their hearts, didn't spend $750,000 to employ a barista with no skills beyond making lattes and surviving on 3 hours of sleep. There has to be more, I said quietly, reaching for the contract with trembling hands. There has to be conditions, clauses, things you're not telling me. Read the contract, he suggested, and his voice had gone silky smooth in a way that made warning bells ring in my head. Every term is outlined in explicit detail, every expectation made clear, every consequence for breach listed in alphabetical order for your convenience. I opened the document and began reading, and with each paragraph, each subsection, each carefully worded clause, I felt my stomach sink lower and lower until it seemed to be somewhere in the vicinity of my feet. The terms were extensive and invasive, requiring me to be available 24 hours a day, to live in his home with restrictions on outside contact, to attend events that ranged from legitimate business dinners to things the contract delicately referred to as conflict resolution sessions, and buried in the middle of page 7 was the clause that made my hands start shaking so badly I almost dropped the entire document. Complete obedience in all matters, no questions asked, I read aloud, and my voice sounded hollow and distant. Failure to comply with any directive, regardless of personal comfort or moral objection, will be considered breach of contract, and will result in immediate termination of the agreement and reinstatement of the full debt with interest and penalties. I require absolute loyalty from the people in my inner circle, Dmitry said, and his voice was matter-of-fact, as if he was discussing the weather rather than asking me to sign away my free will for 12 months. I need to know that when I give an order, it will be followed without hesitation, without debate, without the luxury of conscience getting in the way of necessity. I looked up from the contract to find him watching me with those penetrating gray eyes, and I understood then that this wasn't just about paying off a debt or employing an assistant. This was about something else entirely. Something to do with the way I'd stood my ground this morning and the fascination he'd admitted to feeling. And if what you ask me to do crosses lines I can't uncross? I asked, needing to know exactly how far into hell I was being asked to walk. Then you'll have to decide whether your principles are worth $750,000 and your mother's continued medical care, he replied, with brutal honesty that I had to respect even as it terrified me. I won't lie to you, Adelina. The things you'll see in my world are not pretty, are not kind, are not the sort of things that good people with clear consciences participate in without cost. I thought about my mother in her hospital bed, about the bills that kept coming, about my father who'd created this nightmare and then disappeared into whatever hole he'd crawled into to avoid facing the consequences of his actions, and I realized that I didn't actually have a choice here, had never had a choice from the moment Dmitry Volkov decided I was interesting enough to pursue. Where do I sign? I asked, and I heard the defeat in my own voice, the sound of a woman accepting that her life was no longer her own. He produced an expensive pen from his jacket pocket and held it out to me, and when I took it, our fingers brushed in a contact that sent electricity racing up my arm, and I saw his pupils dilate slightly at the touch. I signed my name on the indicated lines, each stroke of the pen feeling like I was writing my own obituary. And when I finished, Dmitry countersigned with a flourish, and then stood, extending his hand toward me in a gesture that was somehow both a greeting and a claim of ownership. Welcome to my employment, Adelina Russo, he said, as I stood and accepted his handshake, his grip firm and warm and completely encompassing my smaller hand. Mrs. Kozlov will show you to your room, and tomorrow your new life begins in earnest. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and followed the kind elderly woman who'd reappeared as if summoned by telepathy. And she led me through more corridors to a bedroom that was bigger than the entire apartment I shared with my mother, decorated in soft grays and creams that should have been soothing, but instead felt like a beautiful prison cell. She left me with a gentle pat on my hand and instructions in broken English about breakfast times and house rules, and I sat on the edge of the massive bed and tried to process everything that had happened in the span of 12 impossible hours. I managed to sleep for maybe 3 hours before I was jolted awake by sounds drifting up from somewhere below me. Sounds that my exhausted brain initially tried to dismiss as pipes or wind or anything other than what they actually were. Screams, raw and agonized and utterly human, coming from somewhere deep in the bowels of this gothic nightmare I'd agreed to call home. I lay frozen in my expensive sheets, listening to those screams rise and fall like a terrible symphony. And I understood with crystal clarity that the contract I'd signed wasn't just about debt or employment, or even about whatever fascination Dmitry felt toward me. It was about dragging me into his world completely and irrevocably, about making me complicit in the darkness that he inhabited as naturally as breathing. And as the screams finally faded into silence that was somehow worse than the noise, I realized that I'd made a deal with the actual devil, and the only way out was through 12 months of whatever hell he decided to show me. The first week in Dmitry's mansion passed in a surreal blur of luxury and horror that my brain still couldn't quite reconcile, couldn't quite accept as my new reality, even though I woke up every morning in sheets that probably cost more than my monthly salary, at all 3 of my former jobs combined, and went to sleep every night, trying to block out the sounds that sometimes drifted through the old walls like ghosts of the damned seeking someone to witness their suffering. Mrs. Kozlov, the elderly housekeeper, who seemed to genuinely care about my well-being in a way that made absolutely no sense given the circumstances, had taken it upon herself to fatten me up with elaborate meals that I barely had appetite for, muttering in Russian about how I was too thin and too pale and needed to eat more if I was going to survive in this house. And I wanted to tell her that no amount of borscht and blinis was going to prepare me for the reality of what surviving in Dmitry Volkov's world actually meant. My role as his personal assistant turned out to be exactly as invasive and all-consuming as the contract had promised, requiring me to be dressed and ready by 6 in the morning when he preferred to conduct his first meetings of the day. And I quickly learned that the term business meetings was a euphemism that covered everything from legitimate discussions about shipping routes and import regulations to barely veiled torture sessions, where men who'd crossed the Bratva were brought before Dmitri like subjects before a cruel king, and made to answer for their transgressions, while I sat in the corner taking notes that I knew would never see the inside of any legitimate office. He'd given me a laptop and a phone, both of which I was certain were monitored and tracked, and he'd explained in that velvet and steel voice that my job was to observe, to record, to remember everything I saw and heard, because he valued having a witness who could recount events with perfect accuracy should disputes arise later about what was said, or promised or threatened during these encounters. The first time I watched him break a man's fingers one by one while calmly discussing the importance of honoring contracts and respecting territories, I'd had to excuse myself to vomit in the nearest bathroom, and when I'd returned with shaking hands and a face that I knew had gone pale as death, Dmitri had looked at me with something that might have been sympathy, or might have been satisfaction that I was finally understanding the depths of what I'd signed up for. He hadn't sent me away, though. Hadn't released me from my duties or shown any mercy for my weakness, and over the following days and weeks I'd learned to school my features into blankness, to breathe through my nose when the violence became too much, to focus on the expensive art on the walls or the grain of the wooden table rather than on the blood that sometimes spilled onto floors that Mrs. Kozlov would later clean with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this particular task countless times before. But it wasn't just the violence that disturbed me. Wasn't just the casual cruelty and the way Dmitri could order someone's death between bites of his breakfast, as if he was discussing the weather rather than ending a human life. It was the moments of unexpected tenderness that truly unsettled me. The contradictions that made it impossible to categorize him as simply a monster, and therefore easier to hate. I'd seen him spend 40 minutes on the phone with Mrs. Kozlov's grandson, helping the boy with his mathematics homework in patient Russian while reviewing reports about a shipment of weapons that had gone missing somewhere between Moscow and New York, switching between the gentle teacher and the ruthless criminal with such ease that it gave me whiplash. I'd watched him write a check for $500,000 to a children's hospital, insisting it remain anonymous, and then turn around and put a bullet in a man's kneecap for skimming profits from one of his clubs. And the cognitive dissonance of seeing both acts performed by the same hands made my head spin with the impossibility of understanding who or what Dmitri Volkov actually was beneath the expensive suits and the reputation that preceded him like a dark cloud. He was also, I was discovering to my absolute horror and confusion, paying attention to me in ways that went far beyond the professional requirements of our arrangement, noticing things that employers shouldn't notice about their assistants, like the fact that I couldn't stand the texture of mushrooms and would pick them out of any dish Mrs. Kozlov served, or that I had a habit of twisting my hair around my finger when I was thinking, or that I took my coffee with 2 sugars and a splash of cream despite having dumped that oat milk monstrosity on him during our first meeting. His bedroom was next to mine, a fact I'd discovered the first night when I'd heard him moving around in the small hours of the morning, and sometimes I would lie awake listening to his footsteps and wondering what kind of nightmares haunted a man who created nightmares for everyone else. What kind of demons whispered to him in the darkness that he couldn't escape even in sleep. The proximity was becoming dangerous in ways I hadn't anticipated, and definitely didn't want to examine too closely, because there was something magnetic about Dmitri that had nothing to do with his power or his wealth, and everything to do with the way his eyes would find mine across crowded rooms during negotiations, and something would pass between us that felt electric and inevitable and completely inappropriate. He touched me more than was necessary, his hand finding the small of my back when we walked through doorways, his fingers brushing mine when he handed me documents, his body standing close enough during meetings that I could feel the heat radiating from him and smell that dark cologne that had invaded my dreams and turned them into something confusing and unwelcome. 3 weeks into my employment, everything shifted during what should have been a routine meeting with representatives from the Sicilian families who controlled the drug trade on the eastern seaboard and wanted to negotiate new distribution territories that wouldn't conflict with Bratva interests. The meeting was being held in a warehouse near the docks, which should have been my first warning that this wasn't going to be the civilized business discussion that Dimitri's calendar had suggested. And I dressed in the black pantsuit that had become my uniform for these occasions, trying to look professional and unremarkable and definitely not like someone who'd rather be anywhere else on Earth than standing in a freezing warehouse at 11 o'clock at night, watching dangerous men posture and threaten each other over invisible lines on maps of the city. The Sicilian delegation was led by a man named Luca Santoro, who had the kind of smile that made my skin crawl, the kind that suggested he enjoyed hurting people a little too much, and saw everyone around him as potential victims rather than human beings worthy of basic respect. And from the moment he'd walked into the warehouse with his entourage of equally unsettling men, I'd felt the tension in the air shift into something volatile and dangerous. Dimitri had positioned me slightly behind him, and to his left, close enough to hear everything, but far enough away that I wasn't directly in the line of fire, should this meeting deteriorate into the kind of violence that seemed to lurk just beneath the surface of every interaction in his world. And I'd taken my usual position with my tablet ready to record whatever agreements or threats emerged from the next hour of carefully orchestrated hostility. The meeting had started civilly enough, with both sides making their cases for why certain neighborhoods should fall under their control and why the current arrangement wasn't working for their respective organizations. But I could see Dimitri's jaw tightening incrementally with each demand Santoro made, could see the way his fingers drummed against the table in a pattern that I'd learned meant he was calculating the best way to inflict maximum damage should violence become necessary. Then Santoro made a mistake that I knew immediately was going to have consequences that would reshape the rest of this night and possibly the rest of my life. He looked at me with those dead shark eyes and made a comment in Italian that I didn't need to understand the words to know was crude and disrespectful, something that made his men laugh and made Dimitri go absolutely still in the way that apex predators go still right before they strike. "Repeat that," Dimitri said quietly, and his voice had dropped into a register that I'd only heard once before, right before he'd killed a man who'd tried to cheat him in a deal involving counterfeit pharmaceuticals, and I felt ice water replace the blood in my veins because I knew we were about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Santoro, apparently too stupid or too arrogant to recognize the danger he was in, repeated his comment with even more detail and vulgarity, and I watched the last thread of Dimitri's control snap like a wire pulled too tight. What happened next occurred so fast that my brain could barely process the sequence of events. Dimitri was across the table before Santoro could even register the movement, his hand wrapped around the other man's throat, and the gun that had materialized from somewhere in his jacket was now pressed against Santoro's temple, hard enough to leave an impression in the skin. "That woman," Dimitri said in a voice that could have frozen hell itself, "is under my protection, which means that disrespecting her is the same as disrespecting me, and I think we both know what happens to people who disrespect me in my own city." The warehouse had erupted into chaos, guns appearing from every direction as both sides prepared for a shootout that would have left bodies scattered across the concrete floor, and I stood frozen behind an overturned crate where one of Dimitri's men had shoved me for protection, my heart hammering so hard against my ribs that I thought they might crack from the pressure. Santoro's men were shouting in Italian, Dimitri's men were shouting in Russian, and in the middle of it all was Dimitri himself, calm and deadly and completely unbothered by the fact that he was outnumbered and surrounded, because men like him didn't fear death the way normal people didn't calculate odds and risks the way someone with a survival instinct would. Then I saw it. One of Santoro's men, a younger guy with a scar running down his cheek and eyes that were too wide with fear and adrenaline, had his gun trained not on Dimitri but on me where I crouched behind inadequate cover, and I watched his finger start to squeeze the trigger in what felt like slow motion, watched the moment crystallize into something inevitable and final, and my body moved before my brain could catch up with the absolutely insane decision I was making. I launched myself forward, putting myself between Dimitri and the gun, and I felt the bullet hit me with an impact that was somehow both exactly what I'd expected and nothing like I'd imagined. A burning explosion of pain in my left shoulder that sent me stumbling backward into Dimitri's chest as my legs forgot how to hold my weight. The sound that came out of Dimitri's throat wasn't human, wasn't anything I'd ever heard before, and what followed was a massacre that I would see in my nightmares for the rest of my life, assuming I survived long enough to have nightmares about it. He moved through Santoro's men like death incarnate, and every shot was precise and fatal, every movement economical and devastating. And within 90 seconds that felt like 90 hours, every single person who'd walked in with the Sicilian delegation was dead or dying on the warehouse floor, while Dimitri's men stood in shocked silence watching their boss systematically eliminate an entire crew over an insult and a bullet that had found the wrong target. Dimitri was back at my side before the last body hit the ground, and his hands were on my face, my shoulders, everywhere at once, trying to assess the damage while barking orders in Russian that I couldn't understand through the ringing in my ears and the shock that was setting in like frost across my nervous system. "Look at me," he was saying in English now, and his voice sounded strange and almost desperate in a way that didn't match the cold killer I'd just watched decimate a room full of armed men. "Adelina, look at me. Stay with me. You don't get to die. Do you understand me? You don't get to fucking die." "I'm okay," I heard myself say, which was a lie of spectacular proportions because my shoulder felt like it was on fire and my vision was starting to go gray around the edges. But some part of me needed to reassure him even though he was a monster who'd just killed 6 people without breaking a sweat. "It's just my shoulder. I'm okay." "You stepped in front of a bullet for me," he said, and there was something in his voice that I couldn't identify. Something that sounded almost like wonder mixed with rage, mixed with emotions that I didn't have names for. "You could have been killed, you stupid, brave, impossibly reckless woman." Then I was being lifted into his arms like I weighed nothing, and he was carrying me toward the waiting cars while shouting more orders about doctors and safe houses and cleaning crews, and I let my head rest against his chest, because holding it up seemed like too much effort, and his heartbeat was steady and strong against my ear. The last thing I remembered before the shock and blood loss pulled me under was the way his arms tightened around me like he was afraid I might disappear if he didn't hold on tight enough, and the Russian words he was murmuring that I couldn't understand, but that sounded almost like prayers from a man who'd probably stopped believing in God the same day God had stopped believing in him. I woke up in what I gradually recognized as Dimitri's bedroom, which was larger and darker than mine with furniture that looked like it belonged in a czar's palace, and there was an IV in my arm connected to bags of fluid hanging from a portable stand. My shoulder was bandaged and throbbing with a pain that suggested whatever they'd given me for it was starting to wear off. And sitting in a chair pulled up next to the bed, looking like he hadn't slept or changed clothes since the warehouse, was Dimitri himself watching me with an intensity that made me feel like he was trying to memorize every detail of my face in case I disappeared when he blinked. "How long?" I asked, and my voice came out rough and dry like I'd been screaming, though I had no memory of making any sound at all. 18 hours, he replied, and his voice was hoarse in a way that suggested he'd been doing his own share of screaming, or perhaps giving orders that required volume to be heard over chaos. "The bullet went clean through, missed anything vital, but you lost a lot of blood and the shock nearly killed you before we could get you stabilized." "Who was the doctor?" I asked, because some part of my brain that was still functioning normally recognized that we definitely hadn't gone to a hospital where there would be questions and police reports and investigations into how I'd acquired a bullet wound. "Someone who works for me. Someone discreet who won't ask questions or file reports," Dimitri said, reaching out to brush a strand of hair away from my face with fingers that trembled slightly, which seemed impossible because I'd never seen him show the slightest sign of being rattled by anything. "You should have stayed behind the crate. Should have let my men handle the situation. Should have done literally anything other than throw yourself in front of a bullet meant for me." "He was going to shoot you," I said, as if that explained everything. as if the decision I'd made in that split second made any logical sense when examined in the cold light of day. "People try to shoot me on a regular basis," Dimitri replied, and there was something almost tender in the way he was looking at me that made my chest feel tight in a way that had nothing to do with my injury. "It's an occupational hazard of running an organization built on violence and fear, and I've survived this long by being faster and meaner and more willing to do terrible things than anyone who challenges me." "Well, this time someone was faster," I said, feeling exhaustion pulling at me like weights attached to my eyelids. But I forced myself to stay awake because there was something I needed to understand. "Why did you kill all of them? You could have negotiated, could have used the situation to your advantage, but instead you slaughtered everyone in that warehouse over me." His hand had moved from my hair to cup my cheek, and his thumb was tracing small circles on my skin in a gesture that felt far too intimate for a boss touching his employee, far too possessive for what our relationship was supposed to be according to the contract I'd signed. "Because watching you take a bullet that was meant for me did something to me that I can't explain and don't fully understand," he admitted in a voice that was barely above a whisper. And then he said something in Russian that sounded like a confession, or perhaps a curse, and I felt him lean down until his forehead was resting gently against mine. "You've awakened something in me that I thought died years ago. Something I buried so deep I didn't think it could ever claw its way back to the surface. And that terrifies me more than any bullet or rival family or threat against my empire ever could." I wanted to ask him what he meant. Wanted to demand clarification for the storm of emotions I could see swirling in those gray eyes. But the exhaustion was winning, and my words were getting tangled on my tongue. And the last thing I felt before sleep claimed me again was his lips pressing against my forehead in a kiss that felt like a promise and a threat, and a claim all wrapped into one gesture that would change everything between us whether we wanted it to or not. The 2 weeks following the warehouse shooting became a fever dream of blurred boundaries and shifting dynamics that I couldn't have predicted, even if someone had handed me a detailed roadmap of how my relationship with Dmitry Volkov was supposed to evolve from contractual obligation into something infinitely more dangerous and consuming. My recovery happened under his obsessive supervision, with him refusing to let me out of his sight for more than the time it took him to shower or take phone calls that he deemed too sensitive for my ears. And he'd moved my belongings into the room adjacent to his with a connecting door that he left open at all hours, as if he needed the constant reassurance that I was still breathing and hadn't disappeared into whatever afterlife awaited women stupid enough to take bullets for monsters who didn't deserve saving. He conducted his business from his bedroom, with me propped up against pillows in the massive bed that still smelled like him, making me stay within arm's reach while he negotiated territory disputes and planned retaliations against anyone who'd had even tangential connections to the Sicilian family that had tried to kill us both. And I'd become so accustomed to falling asleep to the sound of his voice speaking in rapid Russian about shipments and payments and consequences that I actually slept better with that dark soundtrack than I did in silence. The meetings continued once I was strong enough to sit upright for extended periods. But everything about them had changed, because Dimitri's men had witnessed my act of protection and their boss's violent response to my injury. And now they looked at me with a mixture of respect and wariness that suggested I'd somehow transcended my role as merely his assistant and become something else entirely in the complex hierarchy of his organization. He'd stopped introducing me as his employee and started simply using my name without explanation or context, letting people draw their own conclusions about what I was to him while his hand stayed possessively on my lower back, or his fingers intertwined with mine during discussions as if touching me was as necessary as breathing. And the territorial displays were both thrilling and terrifying, because I knew that being claimed by Dmitry Volkov meant becoming a target for anyone who wanted to hurt him through the people he cared about. The night everything shifted irrevocably into territory we couldn't retreat from started like any other evening in our strange new routine, with dinner served in his private study, where we'd fallen into the habit of eating together while reviewing the day's events and planning for tomorrow's challenges. But there was a tension in the air that I couldn't quite identify, until I noticed the envelope sitting on the corner of his desk with my name written in handwriting that I recognized with a sinking feeling of dread and disgust. Dmitri followed my gaze to the envelope, and something dark and dangerous crossed his face before he reached for it and held it out to me with fingers that had gone rigid with barely contained rage. And when I opened it and saw my father's pathetic attempt at an apology letter, along with a request for money to help him get out of whatever new trouble he'd created for himself, I felt something inside me break completely and irrevocably, because even after everything, even after his debts had nearly cost me my life, Vincent Russo still couldn't see past his own selfish needs long enough to care about what his choices had done to his daughter. "When did this arrive?" I asked, and my voice sounded hollow and distant even to my own ears as I read through the litany of excuses and justifications that my father had apparently believed would move me to forgiveness and financial assistance. "This morning," Dmitri replied, and I could hear the carefully controlled fury in his voice that told me he'd already read the letter and had probably been debating all day whether to share it with me or simply make my father disappear into one of the many unmarked graves that dotted the landscape around his empire. "I had him traced to a gambling house in Queens, where he's apparently accumulated another $60,000 in debt over the past month. And my people tell me he's been using your name as collateral again, despite the fact that you nearly died paying for his last round of stupidity." The rage that swept through me was so complete and overwhelming that I actually crumpled the letter in my fist and threw it across the room with enough force that it bounced off the expensive wallpaper and landed in the fireplace, where flames immediately began consuming the paper and all the empty words it contained. "He sold information about your operations," I said, and the words came out flat and mechanical because some part of my brain had disconnected from my emotions in self-defense. That's what the original debt was really about, wasn't it? He didn't just gamble away money. He sold intelligence to the Sicilian families about your shipping routes and distribution networks. And he used my name as insurance because he knew that they could use me to get to you if things went wrong. Dmitri stood and moved around the desk with that predatory grace that I'd become so familiar with. And when he reached me, he pulled me up from my chair and into his arms with a gentleness that contradicted everything about the violence I knew he was capable of inflicting. "I've known about your father's betrayal since the day I purchased his debts," he admitted against my hair, while his hands stroked soothing patterns down my spine. "I've known that you were meant to be collateral in a war you didn't even know you were part of, and that's why I made you the offer I did. Why I wanted you here where I could protect you from the consequences of his treachery." "You should kill me," I whispered into his chest, because the logical part of my brain that still functioned recognized that I was a liability he couldn't afford, that my bloodline was poisoned with betrayal, and that keeping me alive was a weakness his enemies would exploit. My father used me as a weapon against you, made me complicit in his schemes, whether I knew about them or not, and the smart thing would be to eliminate the threat. "The smart thing," Dmitri said, pulling back enough to tilt my face up toward his with fingers under my chin, "would be to have never let you walk out of that cafe after you spilled coffee on me. Would be to have treated you like any other debt to be collected and forgotten. But we're far past smart decisions now, Adelina. Because somewhere between watching you refuse to cower and feeling you take a bullet meant for my heart, I crossed a line that I swore I would never cross again after the last person I loved was torn apart by my enemies as a message about the price of weakness." Then his mouth was on mine in a kiss that wasn't gentle or tentative but absolutely consuming, filled with months of denied attraction and the kind of desperate possession that came from nearly losing something before you'd fully admitted you wanted to keep it. And I kissed him back with equal fervor because denying what had been building between us seemed pointless when we'd already survived assassination attempts and warehouse shootouts, and the kind of proximity that made pretending we were just employer and employee feel like a lie we'd been telling ourselves to avoid facing the inevitable. We broke apart only when breathing became absolutely necessary, and I saw in his eyes the same wild mixture of need and possession, and something that might have been love if either of us had been brave enough to name it out loud. And when he lifted me onto his desk and stepped between my legs while his hands mapped territory on my body that no contract had given him rights to, I didn't stop him because I'd stopped pretending weeks ago that I didn't want exactly this, didn't crave his touch and his attention, and the way he looked at me like I was something precious that he would burn the world to protect. We crossed every remaining boundary that night in his bed, where I'd spent so many hours recovering under his watchful care. And afterward, lying tangled together in sheets that smelled like sex, and his cologne, and the complete destruction of any professional pretense we'd been maintaining. I should have felt regret, or shame, or concern about how thoroughly I'd violated the terms of my employment. But instead I felt something that might have been peace if peace was possible for women who'd fallen in love with men who ruled empires built on blood and fear. I woke before dawn to find Dmitri already awake and watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. And when I reached for my phone on the nightstand to check the time, I saw 17 missed calls and a text message that made my blood run cold with dread and terrible understanding. It was from a number I didn't recognize, and attached to the message was a photo of my father bound and gagged in what looked like a basement, with text below that read simply, "You for his life. Come alone to the address below. You have 2 hours, or we start removing pieces." The decision to go after my father despite everything he'd done, despite every betrayal and every selfish choice that had led us to this moment, wasn't really a decision at all, but rather the inevitable conclusion to a story that had been written in my DNA long before I'd ever spilled coffee on Dmitri Volkov or signed a contract that had promised to erase debts while creating entirely new and more complicated obligations. I left Dmitri sleeping in the pre-dawn darkness with a letter on the pillow beside him that explained everything I knew and everything I suspected about the trap that was waiting for me. And I included details about the Sicilian connection and Luca Santoro's brother Marco, who'd apparently survived the warehouse massacre by being conveniently absent that night, and had spent the intervening weeks plotting revenge that would hurt Dmitri in the most devastating way possible by taking from him the one thing he'd admitted caring about, since his world had gone dark years ago. I knew he would be furious when he woke and found me gone, knew that my act of leaving would feel like the ultimate betrayal after the night we'd spent tangled together in declarations made with bodies rather than words. But I also knew that I couldn't let my father die no matter how much he deserved whatever fate Marco Santoro had planned for him. Because some fundamental part of my humanity, that even months in Dimitri's world hadn't managed to destroy, still believed that family meant something, even when that family had proven themselves unworthy of the loyalty I was about to die, trying to show them. The warehouse where I'd been summoned was different from the one where I'd taken a bullet, but it had the same smell of rust and abandonment and violence waiting to happen. And when I walked through the door at exactly the time specified in the message, I found my father tied to a chair in the center of an empty space surrounded by men with guns who looked at me with the kind of anticipation that suggested they'd been promised entertainment and were eager for the show to begin. Marco Santoro stood beside my father with a knife that caught the weak morning light filtering through broken windows, and he smiled at me with the same dead-eyed expression his brother had worn right before Dmitri had executed him for the crime of disrespecting something that belonged to the Bratva's most dangerous leader. And I understood in that moment that this had never been about ransom or negotiation, but about inflicting maximum psychological damage on Dmitri by making him watch someone he cared about suffer the way Marco's brother had suffered in those final moments before death had claimed him. "Adelina Russo," Marco said in accented English that dripped with false courtesy and barely concealed sadistic pleasure. "Thank you for being so predictable, for caring about this worthless piece of shit even after he sold you to my family like livestock to cover his gambling debts. Because that weakness is exactly what we needed to draw out the great Dmitri Volkov and show him that his power means nothing when we have something he actually values more than territory, or money, or respect." My father was crying through the gag in his mouth, and I felt nothing but contempt for the man who'd created every problem in my life and was now crying about facing consequences that he'd earned through his own choices. But I kept my face neutral and my voice steady when I spoke, because showing fear would only feed the anticipation I could see building in Marco's eyes. "You're going to kill us both regardless of whether Dmitri comes or not," I stated rather than asked, because there was no point in pretending that this would end any way except with blood on concrete and bodies that would never be found. This was never about ransom or negotiation. This was always about revenge, about making him feel the kind of loss that you felt when he slaughtered your brother and his entire crew. "Smart girl," Marco acknowledged with a nod that suggested he appreciated my understanding of the situation, even as he planned to torture me for however many hours it took for Dmitri to track my phone and walk into the ambush that was clearly being prepared. "We're going to hurt you in ways that will break his mind before we break his body, and we're going to make sure he knows that this happened because he dared to care about something other than power, because in our world, love is the greatest weakness a man can have." But Marco had made the same mistake that everyone who underestimated Dmitri Volkov eventually made, which was assuming that a man who'd built an empire on violence and fear couldn't also be smart enough to plan for contingencies and track assets he considered valuable with the kind of obsessive attention to detail that had kept him alive and in power for over a decade. The explosion that took out the north wall of the warehouse wasn't subtle or quiet, and through the smoke and chaos that followed, I saw Dmitri and what looked like half the Bratva pouring through the opening with the kind of military precision that suggested this rescue operation had been planned and rehearsed and executed with the full resources of an organization that didn't accept failure as an option when their leader's happiness was at stake. What followed was carnage that I watched from where I dropped to the floor the moment the wall exploded, and Dmitri moved through Marco's men like an avenging angel who decided that mercy was for people who hadn't threatened things he'd claimed as his own, and I saw him take bullets that would have killed normal men and keep moving forward with single-minded determination until he reached Marco himself, who'd been trying to use my father as a human shield in a last desperate attempt to bargain for his life. The conversation between them was brief and entirely in Italian that I couldn't understand, but I didn't need translation to know that Dmitri was offering Marco the same choice Marco had planned to offer him: watch someone you care about die or die yourself trying to prevent it. And when Marco made the cowardly decision to abandon his own father and run, Dmitri let him go only long enough to reload before putting 3 bullets in his spine that dropped him face first onto concrete that was already slick with blood from his men. My father, freed from his chair but still gagged and terrified, actually tried to approach me with arms outstretched as if we were going to have some tearful reunion where I forgave him for everything, and we rode off into a sunset that erased years of betrayal and selfishness. But I stepped back and watched as Dmitri's men surrounded him with expressions that promised he wouldn't enjoy whatever conversation was about to happen. "He tried to use you again," Dmitri said as he reached my side and pulled me into arms that were shaking with adrenaline and fear that had probably started the moment he'd woken to find my letter and realized I'd walked into danger without him. "Even knowing that his last betrayal nearly cost you your life, even watching you walk into this warehouse to save him, his first instinct was to try to negotiate using your name as currency, to promise information about you and about us, if we would just let him walk away to create new debts and new disasters." "What will happen to him?" I asked, even though part of me didn't want to know, didn't want to be complicit in whatever justice or revenge Dmitri's world demanded, for the kind of repeated betrayal my father had committed. "He'll disappear," Dmitri said simply, and his tone made it clear that this wasn't negotiable, wasn't something he was willing to compromise on, even for me. "Not dead, because I know that would hurt you despite everything, but gone from your life permanently. Relocated somewhere far from New York, with just enough money to survive but not enough to gamble, and with the understanding that if he ever tries to contact you, or use your name again, that mercy will be revoked in the most permanent way possible." 3 months later, I stood beside Dmitri not in the shadows, as his assistant, but in full view as his partner and his claimed woman, wearing a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, and represented promises about futures that neither of us had thought we'd survive long enough to consider. My mother's medical bills were paid in full, and she'd been moved to a private facility where she received the kind of care that money and Bratva connections could provide. And though she'd been horrified initially by my relationship with a man whose reputation preceded him like a warning label, she'd eventually accepted that her daughter had found something real in the most unlikely of places and with the most dangerous of men. The contract that had brought me into Dimitri's world had been dramatically and ceremonially burned in his fireplace on the night he'd proposed, because he'd wanted me to understand that I was staying not because of debt or obligation, but because I'd chosen him the same way he'd chosen me from the moment I'd stood my ground in a coffee shop and refused to be diminished by fear. I still worked alongside him in his business, still attended meetings and witnessed things that would give normal people nightmares. But now I did it as his equal and his partner rather than his employee, and the organization had learned that disrespecting me meant answering to Dimitri in ways that made his previous reputation for violence seem almost gentle by comparison. We lived in the Gothic mansion that had once felt like a beautiful prison, but now felt like home, and Mrs. Kozlov had taken to calling me Milaya, which I'd learned meant darling in Russian, and she'd started teaching me to cook the traditional dishes that Dimitri loved, while telling me stories about his childhood that painted pictures of a boy who'd lost everything and built an empire from the ashes of that loss. On nights when the darkness crept too close and the memories of violence and near death threatened to overwhelm me, Dimitri would hold me close and remind me in that velvet and steel voice that we'd both been drowning before we found each other, both been surviving rather than living, and that sometimes salvation came from the most unlikely sources, wrapped in the most dangerous packages. I would trace the scars on his back that told stories of survival and suffering, and he would kiss the bullet wound on my shoulder that had healed into a reminder of the moment everything changed. And we would fall asleep tangled together like two people who'd fought their way out of hell and decided that heaven was overrated compared to building something real in the space between darkness and light. So when people asked me later how it felt to have spilled coffee on the Mafia boss and ended up wearing his ring, I told them the truth, that I'd collided with the devil, and somehow we'd saved each other. That love in the darkness burns brighter than anything found in the light, and that sometimes the most dangerous choice you can make is also the only choice that leads to something worth living for. And I wouldn't change a single moment of the chaos and violence and impossible beauty that had brought me to exactly where I was always meant to be.